Welcome to Ray's Reflection, the Common Man's Bible Study. Today we're still on Paul's second missionary journey, and we're traveling with him. He has been in Thessalonica, and he has just left, and the reason he's left is because of the stir he created. And the stir that he created was a bit different than what occurred in the Philippi. The magistrates and the people in charge were a little wiser at Thessalonica, and they realized that they couldn't beat Paul because Paul was a Roman citizen. So what they did is they went to the Agora, which is a marketplace, and they hired some vile fellows. My Bible says that what they were idlers. They were people who just laid around and talked to people and took advantage and created mischief and so on. In other words, they were base individuals, and caused them to go after Paul and Silas and his followers. And they came to, and this is where we left off last week, in Acts chapter 17, verse 6, they went and they found them not. In other words, they looked for Paul and Silas, but Paul and Silas had already moved on. And they drew Jason and certain of the brethren, or in other words the believers, onto the rulers of the city, crying, "These that have turned the world upside down are come here also, whom Jason has received, and these all do contrary to the decrees of Caesar, saying that there is another king, one Jesus." And they troubled the people and the rulers of the cities when they heard these things. Now you notice they're using the same exact argument that the Philippians used. And the Philippians used the argument that in order for a new philosophy or a new religion to be preached in any Roman-controlled area, they'd have to have the approval of Rome, because Rome had a Caesar worship, and they were trying to promote that Caesar worship. And the only time they would allow other worships, especially in the conquered lands, was basically just to keep the peace. And these had to be approved by Rome, and they were. And we will see that there was a lot of these worships of different gods throughout Greece and so on, but it was permitted by the Romans. To allow a new one in would require the approval of Rome. And further, he's talking about a challenge to the kingship of Rome or the Caesars. And this is what he says when he said they were preaching another king, Jesus. And unlike the Philippians, they used a bunch of base fellows, a bunch of rogues, a bunch of no-gooders and troublemakers. And they said, and when they had taken security of Jason and of the others, they let them go. And what they're doing here is basically taking a bond or taking a bail. In other words, they pay a bond and they are released until this issue can be determined later on or at a later date. But mostly they just had to have some reason to let them know they were dissatisfied with the new religion, with the salvation or the gospel that Paul preached, and yet did not want to punish them as they had done in Philippi. And then he says this, and when the brethren immediately sent Paul and Silas by night onto Berea. Now I have a map here, we'll see this a few times. Here is Thessalonica. Paul is traveling this way. He's in Thessalonica. Now he's going to go to Berea, which is about 25 miles to the east. And this is what they do. It says, and Paul and Silas, and by night onto Berea, who coming there went into the synagogue of the Jews. Now that was typical of Paul, to go to the synagogues of the Jews. He had to have a starting place, and this is where he went. And it says here, these were more noble than those in Thessalonica, in that they received the word with all readiness of mind. And they searched the scriptures daily whether these things were so. Now, when he says they are more noble, than those of Thessalonica. If you go back to Thessalonica and you say, okay, how did the gospel get spread in Thessalonica? Well, the Bible says here that Paul reasoned with the Jews, and reason means there was conversation, there was some kind of debate going back and forth. And the problem with Thessalonica is the debates were very much like the Pharisees and Jesus. They were very antagonistic. Whereas the people in Thessalonica, in Berea, were, he said, more noble. In other words, they were willing to listen. And they would then go and they would search the scriptures to see if what Paul was saying was true, or what anybody was saying was true. And if it wasn't true, they would totally dismiss it. And if it was true, then they would have to deal with it. We always uphold the Bereans because of their willingness to search the scriptures, and many pastors preach to their congregation, search the scriptures, and the scripture itself encourages the searching of scripture to see that these things are so. I remember when I was a very young Christian, just saved, I took on the attitudes of the Bereans, but I didn't do it for the noble reasons they did. I did it because I was very angry. I was very angry that I had been putting my trust in men, in priests, and these men literally were steering me to hell. And when I got saved, I vowed to God that I would not again allow a man to determine what I am to believe. So to this day, which has been a lot of years, have been 37 years, to this day, if I hear something that I have never heard before, something new, I will not dismiss it, nor will I accept it. I will simply hold it and remember it. Sometimes I write it down. And then, in the privacy of my own study, I will research what has been said to see if it is so, to see if it holds water, see if it's true. If it's true, then I feel that God is the one who led me to it. I don't look at it as, well, that man told me what it was, and therefore I don't quote that fellow. It is the scriptures. God has shown me, and this is how God has led me. This is what the Bereans did. They listened to Paul. They didn't reject him. They didn't accept him. They simply took the things that he said, went to the scriptures, examined the scriptures to see if those things were so. And if they were, then they had to make a decision. They had to deal with it. And this is what Paul is saying. And there are a lot of people that way. So when the Bereans, quote, say that they were more noble, their way of dealing with truth is far different than a lot of people's. When I say I take on the disposition of the Bereans, I don't do it in a noble fashion that they did it. I did it because I was angry, and I vowed I would never again trust men to tell me what was so. And I can remember clearly the first time I went to after studying for 6 years, I went to a church, and a different church, and the preacher was preaching in Greek. He was preaching English, and he threw out the word Greek, and he threw out the word koinonia. Now, koinonia is fellowship. It's a Greek word for fellowship. And I was sitting in the pew, and I did not know what koinonia was. And therefore, I was in a position to have to trust that man and believe that he was telling me the truth because of koinonia. So I went out and picked up 5 Greek courses to learn what koinonia was, so that when anybody now shoots a Greek word out and says, this is what it says in the Greek, etc., I can either say yes or I can say no, but they're not in a position to control what I think or what I believe. And I will never again put myself in that position. I just won't. Therefore, I admire these Bereans. And it says, therefore, it says many of them believed. In other words, they believed because they looked into the scriptures, they looked into the Old Testament, and what Paul was telling them was correct. It says this, not only them, but he said also honorable women who were Greeks. Now we ran across this concept that the Greeks or the Gentiles were more free. Their women were much more free to rise to prominence than the Jewish woman was. In the Jewish society, the Jews had suppressed them to the point where if a Jewish woman or a wife was going to learn anything, she was going to learn it from her husband, and she could not move to positions of prominence. But in the Greek society, they could. And here are honorable women who were Greeks, and of men. And these are Gentile men, these are Greek men, etc. Not a few. There were a lot. So there were a lot of people being saved, but not everybody. And it says this, but, and here it is, but when the Jews of Thessalonica had knowledge that the word of God was preached by Paul in Berea, in other words, when they realized that Paul had escaped, they had not caught him, but he had gone to Berea and he was preaching the same thing in Berea, they came also and stirred up the people. In other words, these idlers, these no-gooders, these lowlifes of society moved over to Berea and attempted to cause the same problem in Berea. And then immediately the brethren sent away Paul to go, as it were, by sea. And we will see that. I will show you that. But Silas and Timothy abode there still, in other words. So Silas and Timothy stayed in Berea, and they got rid of Paul. Because obviously, when we look at this, we see that these two were like aides. Paul was the mouthpiece. Therefore, Paul was blamed for instigating this. And they that conducted Paul brought him to Athens, and receiving a commandment from Silas and Timothy to come to him with all speed, they departed. Now, I got another map here. Now, they took Paul from Berea here, brought him down by sea. Now, he traveled all the way by sea, all the way down here, swung around all the way to Athens. Now, you will notice that's quite a bit different than moving here from city to city. Now you got all the way down to Athens, and therefore the news of what he has done traveled through here, but it did not get down here to Athens. So now Paul is in Athens, and now it says this, while Paul waited for them at Athens, and he waited for Silas and Timothy, while he waited for them at Athens, his spirit was stirred in him. In other words, the spirit that was in him just tore him apart from what he saw. And when he saw that the city wholly was given to idolatry. Now, there were, Athens was a place of education, a place of philosophy, a place where men could think. And the philosophies had risen, it had created a number of different gods, and there were a number of statues all over. And not only had they had statues all over, but they even had statues, a number of statues, that was to the unknown God. So these people, shall we say, for all practical purposes, looked religious, but they were very idolatrous. We look at the same, today we look at the same thing Paul looked at, and we call it art. But in Paul's day, it wasn't art. It was things to worship. And these idols caused Paul to just be torn apart inside. And therefore he just could not sit still. And who can blame him? Because these people were lost. And he says, therefore disputed he in the synagogue with the Jews, and with the devout persons, and in the marketplace daily with them that met with him. And so when we look at this, etc., we see that Paul obviously talked. Wherever he went, he talked. You will see here, it starts off with, he started off with the synagogues, and then from the synagogues, he talked to different people, individuals, prominent people, devout people. Shall we say, people who were religious or really believed what they were worshiping. And in the marketplace, that would be the agora, where people would get their supplies for the day, etc. And he said he did this daily, and anyone that would meet with him. So Paul is not waiting for Timothy and Silas. Paul is beginning his preaching already. It says this, then certain philosophers of the Epicurean and other Stoics encountered him. Now, who are they? The concept in Athens was, what is truth? If you go back just a few years to the conversation Pilate had with Jesus, Pilate asked the same question, what is truth? And for years, the philosophers had been arguing as to what is truth. And the group of Epicureans here, the Epicureans, were from the school that determined that truth could not be determined except for what came in your senses. If you could feel it, if you could see it, if you could hear it, whatever you heard, smell, touch, whatever, that was truth. That was true. In other words, if you wish and you apply it to religious sense, if I see it, I'll believe it. So the Epicureans lived a life that was rather immoral, and because whatever they did and whatever they felt was good was right. Now, we have people like that today who live lives that are terribly immoral, and they will do anything that they deem it feels good, therefore they do it. And how much do? They do whatever society permits them to do. So, and therefore we have this in America. Homosexuals are like that. They're a branch off the Epicureans. And now the Stoics are different. They think truth can be determined or arrived at by discipline and by controlling the appetites of the body and so on. So you have these two groups. You have these two extremes. One that does whatever the body desires, and the other controls the appetite. So these two groups were the main function of Athens. And notice what they said. They said, what will this babbler say? The word for babbler is often what we call seed pickers. A seed picker is a person who is be like a slave who's out in the fields picking the smallest of crops, and therefore they're seed pickers. That's what he calls them. They're lowlifes. He said, what are these lowlifes going to say? Now you have to understand, these people, these Epicureans and these Stoics, are the modern day academia. Most of our colleges, most of our schools, even our high schools, follow in this category. And therefore, anything that pertains to godliness, they dismiss completely. And therefore, here's what he's saying. Others, he seemed to be a setter forth a strange God, because he preached unto them Jesus and the resurrection. And now they're going to have a problem, because Paul to them is teaching another God. And therefore we have a problem with, in Athens, just like we did in any other Greek city, you got a problem with, whoa, this is going to upset the economy. Now let's go back and take a look at what these statutes and this idolatric system did. It literally controlled the economy of a city. In other words, you would have an idol worship of a certain god, and that god would demand certain things and demand the exchange, the sacrifices, and you'd have to pay for this and so on. There was a great economy around it, and therefore, if you're going to upset and oppose this, you could upset the economy of a city. And Athens was controlled by the worship of these various gods. And therefore, here comes Paul with a new God, and therefore you're going to upset the balance of that city. So they're going to take a tremendous issue. The issue isn't, wow, what am I going to do spiritually? What's going to happen to me spiritually? That's not the issue here at all. The issue is here, what is going to happen economically? And is Rome going to accept this? And so now they're going, and even worse, Paul is preaching something that is extremely foreign to them. A new God isn't foreign to them. what is foreign to them is the resurrection. And you have to remember the Epicureans are basically people who live and die, and that's the end of it. And so, and I met a man that way. I was in the hospital for a week, and my roommate was a man by the name of Carboni, and I can remember he believed that a man was born and a man died, and he was no different than a dog. He died, he was put in the ground, that was the end of it. And everything that I believed, he says, was just a way to control the people. It was some kind of euphoria, some kind of balm or a salve that you put on a wound, and therefore it would calm the people. And I tried to talk to him, and he would shut me down completely. So finally, on the last day, when I was told I was being discharged, I called my wife, and I had about 20 minutes before she arrived. And I said, I got a question for you. And this is basically what the Athenians would reason. And my question to him was this: what if I'm wrong? What have I lost? And he looked at me and pondered for a moment. He said, well, nothing. He says, you live a good life. He says, you got a nice family. He says, you're a nice guy. He said, no, you haven't lost anything. It seems to work for you. So I kept getting dressed, etc. In a few more minutes, I looked at him and I said, I got a question for you. One more question, that's it. What, if you're wrong, what have you lost? And you should see the visible expression on his face changed, and I realized I had touched a nerve. And my wife came in just then, and I handed him a tract, and he took it. I don't know if he ever read it, but for once I had gotten through to him, and therefore maybe he would have listened. But here they're going to listen to him. It says this. It says, and they took him and they brought him onto the Areopagus. And Areopolis or Areopagus. This is a picture of it here, obviously in disarray after years of destruction. And he comes to this place. Now, this place is a place where the Roman people and the magistrates, etc., would bring people in and would judge them. And not only would they judge them, but would take care of the affairs of the city. They would bring in murderers, they would bring in philosophers to hear them, and so on. And there they would make judgments in this Areopagus and Areopagus, yeah. And they did this so that we may know what this new doctrine of which thou speakest. And this basically was on this mountain here. And this is Mars Hill. This is where the Areopagus was, the Areopagus. And now he says, for thou bringest certain strange things to our ears. We would know, therefore, what these things mean. In other words, they wanted to know what these things were, because these things would upset the city. If it was accepted, this would turn the city upside down. For all the Athenians and strangers who were there spent their time in nothing else, but either to tell or to hear some new thing. This is the character of Athens, because they were the educational center of the world. They were the cultural center of the world. They loved to hear new things. They loved to talk about new things. And they would debate back and forth. In other words, it was a tremendous amount of idle chatter. And they spent their time in it. They loved to hear things that would please their ears. And they loved to debate. And they loved to propose new things. And I think of educational forum. And I can remember debates like this in college over nothing. Over nothing. I can remember when I was in college, the professor said, if a tree falls in the woods and there's no one around to hear it, doesn't make a noise. And oh my, the debates that went on, they were, some of these kids just wanted to be heard and wanted everyone to know how smart they were. And I can remember very clearly, there was this little girl. She was small of stature. She was quiet. She hadn't said anything. The professor looked at her and decided to pick on her. And he said, her name was Rachel. And he said, Rachel, we haven't heard from you. Do you have anything to add to this conversation? Without looking up, she was doodling in her notebook, and without looking up, and she kept right on doodling. She says, you're not arguing whether it makes a noise or not. You're arguing the existence of God. If you cannot apply your senses to it, you cannot smell him, you cannot hear him, you cannot taste him, you cannot whatever. He says, does it exist? That is what you're arguing. And she hadn't lifted up her head yet, and she stopped. And the class went dead. And it was within 1 minute, the entire room was empty. Because she had struck the nail on the head. She realized that all this idle bantering back and forth and eloquent display of orations was worthless, was meaningless, because they had missed the gist. And these people had missed the gist of what was going on. And Paul is about to tell them. So next week, we will look at Paul on Mars Hill and examine his sermon and see what he says, and to see how he deals with all of this educational garbage, all these philosophies that are designed to oppose Christianity. He's going to deal with them and see where it leads him. So until next week, I bid you Godspeed from on Victory's side. We'll see you next week.